the documentary hypothesis makes it impossible to understand Genesis 1-4 in a theologically adequate way. Genesis 2 in this logic is the 8th day when God hands over his work into the hands of human beings. I think we must learn again to see not only what is in the text, but also what is implicitly in the text.
Hey everyone, this is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today I'm on with Dr. Benjamin Kilchör. I'm not pronouncing that right, but it's also apparently not possible for me to pronounce it right. We're going to be talking about Genesis 1-3 and how it mirrors the priestly sanctuary of the tabernacle in Exodus. Dr. Kilchör, how are you doing today? And can you tell us a little bit about your background?
I'm fine, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So you asked me to say something about me. Did I understand it right? Yes. Yes, I'm from Switzerland. I did some studies in German language and literature, I think on a bachelor level. This might be undergraduate, or I'm not sure how you call it. And then I moved to theology, and I studied theology in Basel in Switzerland, and also in Leuven in Belgium. And in Leuven I did my MTH and also then my PhD, my doctoral studies. I wrote a dissertation about Deuteronomy, about the legal hermeneutics of Deuteronomy. Afterwards, I did an internship in the Reformed Church of Zurich, the Church of Zwingli and Bullinger, and was ordained as a minister in the Reformed Church in Zurich. And then I was appointed as an assistant professor in Basel at the Staatsunabhängige Theologische Hochschule, State Independent Theological University, something like this, with a tenure track. And I finished the tenure track in 2020 and was then appointed as a full professor. So I'm now teaching Old Testament as a full professor in Basel for 2 years.
Awesome. Now, can you pronounce your last name for those listening?
Kilchör.
Yeah, I can't pronounce that. Okay.
In Swiss German, yes. even the Germans cannot pronounce it correctly. Only the Swiss people.
That's awesome. Okay. So you wrote a paper, and it was actually just submitted. Can you talk about just a summary of what you're planning on arguing today?
Yes. Basically, I argue that the 4 chapters of Genesis 1-4, the first 4 chapters of the Bible, that they form something like a theological, liturgical context that has parallel in the construction and in the worship of the tabernacle. So basically, I argue that Genesis 1 has a correspondence to the Holy of Holies, where the glory of God appears, creates and also sanctifies in some sense the creation. In Genesis 2, the antechamber, the holy room, is built by the Garden of Eden with the tree in it, which corresponds to the menorah, the 7-armed light. And Genesis 3, then in Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve are thrown out of the garden, they come to the place, to the outer court, or to the courtyard in the tabernacle, the place of death. And Cain and Abel bring there the first sacrifice, and the courtyard is also the place where the altar is in the tabernacle. So we have the different rooms that correspond to the rooms of creation, or the chapters of creation that corresponds to the rooms of the tabernacle.
And this has implications, something about an 8th day. So Genesis 2 is an 8th day. Can you talk about that?
Yes. both on Mount Sinai and also in the Tabernacle, even in the Solomonic Temple, and later on in the Ezekiel Temple, Ezekiel 40 to 48, it is always the case that first the sanctuary is completely filled with the glory of God for 7 days, and on the 8th day, God hands over the work that he has begun to the priests, to the people, and liturgically this means that on the 8th day the priests begin the service in the sanctuary, and for example in Leviticus 9, Moses and Aaron can only enter the tabernacle for the first time after 7 days of consecration. And if we now understand Genesis 1 as the creation and consecration of the earth as the place where God's glory is to dwell, then the question arises as to what kind of worship takes place in this sanctuary. So we have the building and the consecration of the sanctuary for 7 days, but what does then happen? And the answer is that God creates Adam and Eve in his image to represent his glory, and he places then the first human beings in the Garden of Eden to perform priestly service there. And Genesis 2 in this logic is the 8th day when God hands over his work into the hands of human beings to continue it as his representatives. And maybe I can also say something. This interpretation has also some implications for the so-called documentary hypothesis, where Genesis 1 is attributed to the so-called priestly source named P, while Genesis 2 to 4 are attributed to a non-priestly or Yahwistic source, because God is called Elohim in the first chapter, he's called Yahweh in chapters 2 to 4. And the liturgical connection between the consecration of the sanctuary, the tabernacle, and the installation of the priest for regular worship is then torn apart, and the documentary hypothesis makes it impossible to understand Genesis 1 to 4 in a theologically adequate way. I think, because they are just exegetically interpreted distinct from each other, and then the relationships cannot be seen. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, so obviously scholarship has talked a lot about the parallels between Genesis 1 and the Exodus and the Tabernacle, and they've talked some about Genesis 2 and 3. Can you talk about what they usually say about it? Like, what are their typical views? Some people say that there's no parallels, and some people think that there is, like, John Walton. Can you talk about the typical views that people take on that?
The standard view for the last 200 years or so is that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3, or we can also say 2 to 4 if we include the Cain and the Abel narrative. The standard view is that they originally had nothing to do with each other. They are just two completely different creation accounts that were juxtaposed at some point during the composition of the Pentateuch. And since the entire tabernacle narrative in the book of Exodus belongs completely to the priestly source, like Genesis 1, the references between the 7th-day creation and the tabernacle are generally accepted. But since Genesis 2 and 3 is said to be from a different source, references to Genesis 2 and 3 to the tabernacle are usually not even sought. And especially in the European context, more than in the American context, however, more and more exegetes see that Genesis 2 and 3 refers to Genesis 1 in many ways, in theological ways, also in language ways. So they also have kind of allusions to Genesis 1 in formulations, and that these cannot possibly be two independent texts. But because the sources were always separated from each other, this has led to the fact that many now assume that Genesis 2 and 3 is a later addition to Genesis 1. For example, it is said, this is what Eckhard Otto from the University of Munich says, that the priestly source or that in the priestly source, a story of the fall of man was missing. We just have the creation account, and then later the story goes on, and something happened in between, but we do not know what in the priestly source, because Genesis 3 and 4 belong to the non-priestly source. And therefore, it is not at all understandable how it came from the good creation to the bad state of the earth. And therefore, he argues that a later author wrote Genesis 2 and 3 to close this plausibility gap of the P source. But my argument goes even further. Genesis 2 and 3, in my view, is not simply a later addition that refers to Genesis 1, but the paradise narrative with the Garden of Eden and with the fall belongs logically and conceptually as a continuation of Genesis 1. They belong together, and the texts are so strongly interwoven, I personally think, in a theological and also in a linguistic way, that I believe it is impossible to separate them in any way, neither as two completely distinct sources, but also not as an original source with a later addition.
Gotcha. Okay. And so, for those that aren't familiar with it, can you give what are the best possible reasons to think that Genesis 1, 2 to 3, or Genesis 1 and then through 2, 3? What are those? What's in the text that makes people think that that refers to the tabernacle?
If I understand you right, you are talking of the connections between the priestly Genesis account and the tabernacle, right?
Yes.
I can maybe pick out 3 points. The first is that in Exodus 24, verses 15 to 18, God's glory cloud appears on the top of the Mount Sinai, and it remains there for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, God calls Moses into the cloud to show him the heavenly sanctuary. And after that, Moses is to build the tabernacle in the earthly image of it. And this is a direct back reference to Genesis 1. This I can name this as the first point. And the second point, this is the beginning of it, of the parallels. Second point, I can point to the conclusion. The building of the tabernacle is concluded in Exodus 39, 23 with the words, thus all the work of the tabernacle or of the tent of meeting was finished, or of the tabernacle was finished. And this is exactly the same phrase that we find after the completion of the 6-day creation, that the heavens and the earth were finished. We have the same formulation for the finishing of the creation and of the tabernacle. And thirdly, in between, when God first speaks to Moses and when the building is finished, we have instructions for the building of the tabernacle in 7 speeches. So God speaks 7 times to Moses, and the 7th speech is the instruction to keep the Sabbath. And all these parallels show that the tabernacle is a sort of a microcosmic image of creation.
Gotcha. Well said. Okay. And of course, there's other reasons, and I'll be doing a video soon that'll go really in detail. So that'll be good for people to watch. So on the topic of Genesis 2, can you talk about why you think that mirrors Leviticus 9?
Yes, first, I think it should be noted that Genesis 2 and 3, the paradise account, or how we can call it, because I don't think it's a second creation account, it contains many tabernacle motifs. The holy antechamber of the tabernacle is full of garden motifs, starting with the menorah. That symbolizes the tree of life. It's a tree with the 7 arms, and it looks like a tree as it is described there. And then we have the shewbread table that represents the yield of grain. So we have the fruits of the trees, the yields of the grain, so we have a very clear garden image in the tabernacle, in the antechamber, and the holy antechamber in the tabernacle is also symbolically guarded by cherubim, which are also woven into the side walls and also into the entrance curtains, like the cherubim that guarded the Garden of Eden after the fall. The priest in the sanctuary, therefore, cultically, when he enters the sanctuary, he cultically represents Adam that re-enters the Garden of Eden. And even the words in Genesis 2 that are used for Adam's mission in the garden, that he shall serve and keep it, are otherwise used for the cultic service of priests and Levites. Now, with regard to Leviticus 9, it is the case there that in the first verse, Leviticus 9:1, God begins, the chapter begins with God calling Moses and Aaron on the 8th day, explicitly said, after 7 days of tabernacle consecration, to begin their priestly service. And in the end of the chapter, they enter the tabernacle for the first time. And so at the end of Genesis 1, the 7-day creation, if you then ask yourself what actually follows the 7th day, the answer is surely the 8th day follows the 7th day. And the 8th day is the day when the priests enter the sanctuary for the first time. And this is exactly what happens in Genesis 2. When it says that the Lord God took Adam and put him in the Garden of Eden to serve and keep it. So we have this parallel of the entering of the garden space, or the holy space.
Wow, that's very fascinating. I've never heard it like that. Just a couple more things. So I don't know if you mentioned this, but there's the mention of lest you die in Genesis 2 or maybe even 3, and that parallels Leviticus somehow. Could you talk about that just real quick?
I'm not sure in which places exactly we find the same formulation, but we have the same formulation both in the commandment. Well, I think we have to say God's first commandment, in fact, is the commandment: you may eat from all the trees. It's not you what you are not allowed to eat, but what you are allowed to eat first, and then. But from this tree you may not eat, lest you die. There we have this formulation in Genesis 2, and we find it certainly again in Leviticus 11, where we have the legislation on allowed animals to eat or not to eat, and eating the wrong animals, I think, are also under this formulation, lest you die. And there is some relationship, I think, between the legislation on clean and unclean animals and what is allowed to eat, and the fruit from the tree that is also forbidden. So we see also that eating commandments are very important. That the first commandments all are related to eating. I think personally this is because man is created to join the table of God, and therefore eating commandments are the most important commandments. And in fact, we even find allusions then when Eve takes the fruit. It is formulated not just she ate the fruit, but she took it and ate it. Take take and eat. These is the same combination of verbs that then Jesus will use for the supper when he says take and eat. And so by eating the wrong thing, death came to people, but by eating the body of Christ and by drinking his blood in a context where we have an absolute commandment that forbids to eat blood in Israel. So eating blood is one of the most worst things Israelites can do. And but it is the Lord's Supper is something like the opposite to this first fruit, and life comes also back by something that is eaten in a relationship with a commandment of God. Yes.
So you mentioned how the Levites weren't supposed to eat certain things. I was kind of mentioning Leviticus 10:6, where it says, after the death of Nadab and Abihu, Moses reminds Aaron, Eleazar, and Ithamar not to go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting, lest you die.
Okay.
Is there another reference that talks about lest you die?
Yes. I think I already forgot this again, but yes, you are right. I have written about this too, and this refers to. But the things are also related to each other. Sacred food and sacred space, because Adam and Eve are then also driven out of the Garden of Eden, that they may not eat from the fruit of the tree of life. So it's not primarily about the space, but about what they could eat there, and so they are not allowed to enter the garden anymore, because they are not allowed to eat the tree of life anymore after the fall. And yes, I think in Leviticus 10 we have this formulation with regard to entering the presence of God, and we have then Leviticus 10 tells us how God's presence is not allowed to enter, and the opposite is then in Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, and this begins with remembering what happened to Nadab and Abihu. So it takes up the story of Leviticus 10 and explains then when and how Aaron may enter the presence of God. And between these two things, between Leviticus 10 and 16, how it is forbidden to enter and how it is commanded to enter the presence of God, we have chapters 11 to 15 with cleanness legislation about what to eat, about leprosy and all these things.
Great. And regarding Genesis 3, how does that mirror Leviticus 10?
Leviticus 10 tells us a story of Nadab and Abihu, two of the sons of Aaron and therefore priests, and they lay their hands on the holy thing and they die instantly. It is not very clear said there what they did, but certainly they laid their hands on something what was holy, what was not allowed for them. And it is emphasized then that when they die within the holy antechamber, their bodies are carried out from the sanctuary in their garments, in their clothes. And this has a direct analogy in Genesis 3. Adam and Eve reach for the fruit that God said, if you will eat it, then you will die. They don't drop that, but they must leave the realm of the tree of life and enter the realm of death. And after the fall, they realize that they are naked and they are ashamed. And even before God drives them out of the garden, he makes garments for them in which they then must leave the garden, so they are clothed before they leave the garden. And the word that is used, the Hebrew word for their garments, is otherwise used in the Pentateuch only for Joseph's beautiful garment, and I think this has also priestly allusions, but this would be another discussion maybe. And it is used for the priestly garments. So only Adam and Eve, Joseph, and the priests have this kind of garments. And then in Exodus, both Exodus 20:26 and also Exodus 28:42 emphasize that priests must not enter the presence of God naked. And therefore, I think Leviticus 10 reflects the story from Genesis 3, where man violates what is sacred and is punished with death, and his nakedness then has to be clothed.
You have the mention of the walking in the garden. I know a lot of scholars don't think it should be like you had a literal God walking in the garden. Can you talk about like what you thought that meant, and as well as how that kind of is a reference to the Leviticus?
The walking of God in the garden. Yes, we find this is a formulation that God walks is not often used. We have it in Genesis 3:8 after the fall, when God enters the garden and he walks in the garden. And we have it again in Leviticus 26 as a promise in these blessings and curse sections that God will walk among Israel, combined with the promise of his tabernacle, that his Mishkan, his holy place will be among Israel. We have this combination, and what it means, there is a very interesting formulation in Genesis 3:8. God came, and then it is often translated in the coolness of the evening, or something like this, in the evening breeze. And then we have the image that God is an old man and the day is too hot for him. He may not come into the garden when the sun is on the top, and then in the evening when it gets a bit colder, he can enter the garden. But the Hebrew formulation is le ruach hayom. This means, in fact, a verbal translation would be God walked into the garden as the spirit of the day, is the verbal translation, and we find, for example, the same or a similar formulation in the book of Isaiah, that God will act as the spirit of judgment. And as far as I understand it, this tells us that God does not come with a body. He walks, but not as a body, but as a spirit, as a spiritual being. He enters the garden, and the spirit of the day might refer back. This is one of these details that might refer back to Genesis 1, where God called the light day, and the night, the darkness he called night. So the spirit of the day is also the spirit of light. Adam and Eve are hiding in the trees because they want not to be seen by God, but God comes as the spirit of the day, as the spirit of light, as the spirit of judgment also, and his eyes that shine his light will go through the trees and find Adam and Eve. This is how I would understand it. So the formulation God walked as the spirit would already imply he is not an old man who comes there and is somewhat tired, but he comes as a spirit, because God is a spirit. Yes, this is how I understand it.
Fascinating. Okay, and now Genesis 4. So that talks about the sacrificing with Cain and Abel. And
maybe I can add something to what I said before. Excuse me. Okay. I think to understand the essence of priestly ministry, we must see what is in the tabernacle. We have, I already mentioned this, the menorah and the shewbread, and they symbolize fruit and grain. And the shewbread is on a table, what also shows that man is invited to the table of God. So the sense of it is God brings them in the garden and tells to them, see, I have given this for you to eat. And the altar of burnt offerings, this will also lead us then to Genesis 4. The altar of burnt offerings, on the other hand, is outside of the tabernacle in the forecourt or courtyard. I'm not sure which is the most appropriate word of it. And it does not belong in the room of life, the altar, but in the room of death. And I think it's important to understand that sacrifice is not the actual task of the priest. So Adam and Eve were not created to sacrifice blood offerings, but it only comes into play after the priest is expelled from the tabernacle. And Moses and Aaron are not allowed in Leviticus 9 to enter the tabernacle in Leviticus until they have made the first sacrifice. This means that the need for sacrifice is a consequence of the fall, and therefore it is logical that in the Bible the first sacrifice takes place in Genesis 4. Maybe this is where you wanted to ask also your next question. And Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam, offered the first sacrifice east of the garden by the entrance, and just as in the tabernacle, the altar of burnt offerings is in front of the entrance of the tabernacle, and also in the east, because the Holy of Holies is in the west, and then the steps, every step is a step eastward. Yes. So, sorry, maybe I already said something you wanted to ask, but I think because this relationship also with Genesis 4 shows that burnt offerings are just a task that is given due to sin, but this is not the main task of priests. The priest shall be in the space of life, and they only bring the sacrifices to enter the room and to do their priestly service in the holy part and not in the courtyard. Yes.
Good. Is that all you had to say about Genesis 4?
Yes, maybe yes, I think so.
Okay. Okay. So obviously, a pattern like this is very powerful. It doesn't seem like it's just a coincidence, but that makes things like that. Typically in life, things like that don't happen just a coincidence. So that's going to make people think, okay, maybe it's one story was made up, or Genesis 1 to 4 didn't actually happen, or maybe the passages in Leviticus didn't happen, or they're both made up. What does this say about the historicity, the reliability of the text?
Personally, I think it speaks neither for nor against the historicity. One can read references between the creation and between creation and the sanctuary also in two directions. One can either read from sanctuary to creation, start with the sanctuary, and this would then mean the Israelites, they know the tabernacle service, and on basis of their service in the tabernacle, creation is explained to them. During the service, they shall learn what creation is, also who man is, and why he has lost access to the sanctuary, and so on. But one can also read from start with creation and read from creation to the sanctuary, and this is, of course, the natural reading direction of the Pentateuch. Creation is not presented then as a sanctuary, but rather the sanctuary later on is an image of creation. Creation comes first, and God gives instructions as to how Israel should ritually participate in a cosmic event in its worship service. And therefore, I think one can think differently about the historicity of Genesis 1 to 4, or also on the historicity of the tabernacle account, and still follow my reading strategy. So, yes, I don't think that it can contribute much to the question of historicity, just to the question of composition of the Pentateuch.
Okay, so someone like John Walton has said that Genesis 1 describes God creating his consecrating his cosmic temple, inaugurating. Do you take a view like that, or do you think it's something different?
I think, as far as I know the work of John Walton, I have read some of it, and I think we are not so far from each other. So I think my thoughts are close to his thoughts. I also have some differences in the understanding of creation. Especially, I think my main difference with him is Genesis 1, verse 1, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. And I think heaven is this is the first act, in fact, of creation, and heaven is the invisible world, and earth is the visible world, and therefore I still think, and there is also more recent research that goes in this direction, but of course it's still the minority position that we have something like creatio ex nihilo in Genesis 1:1, but I think this does not directly relate now to the question you asked, and I think in this questions I am close to John Walton.
Very fascinating, very fascinating. Maybe we'll have to talk about that sometime else.
Yes, maybe.
So, in regards to Adam and Eve, some people have, the text doesn't really say, Genesis 1-4 doesn't really say how long they were in the garden. Does this view would mean that, all these events like happen really quickly, or does this tell us at all about how quickly they happened?
I can't think of anything in the text that suggests that. And also between Leviticus 9 and 10 we have the same situation, and also there it is unclear to me how much time has passed. So it could be implied that it is just at the same day, so very close to each other, but I don't think that this that it is necessary to read it this way. So I don't know.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned that Adam and Eve and Moses, something about the garments, that they only have the garments. You said that we might not have enough time, but it seems like we have a lot of time actually. Would you be able to talk about that a little bit more?
The garments?
Yeah, you said something about that, like something like only Moses had the specific garments.
No, Joseph.
Joseph, okay. Yeah,
this word for the garments is used only when God makes garments for Adam and Eve, and it is used many times for the priests, also for the high priest, and in addition to that it is also used for this beautiful garment that that Joseph wears, and Joseph therefore is then thrown into the hole by his brothers. And I think there is also some priestly conception in the Joseph story, also with his dreams. We have then also the grain and the star images and so, but I did not really invest many research into this. I just realized that at several points for Joseph we see that he has the Ruach of Adonai, the Spirit of the Lord, and he has wisdom. Therefore, this the combination we also find in Exodus 31 with the workers that built the tabernacle. So there are several connections, I think, also between Joseph and priestly concepts and thoughts, but I cannot say a lot about it because I did not really do some research on it. There is just something there in the text. Yes.
We'll add it to the list of things to talk about. So a big complaint that people have regarding this type of view is that it never actually says that Genesis 1 or even Genesis 1 to 4 has anything to do with a tabernacle. It doesn't say anything about a building. Do you think that is a reason not to take this view?
No, I think this is a modern rationalistic view on it. And I try always to explain it in this way also to my student. There was an important change between ancient times, not only biblical things, but also the whole ancient Near East, also I think even the Greek people and so the ancients, and the modern times. And this is, I think, everything has to do with the question of the relationship between, I hope I say it correctly in English, the relationship between matter and spirit, and what is first. And the ancients were convinced that spirit is first, and that spirit forms matter. And he also brings order into chaotic matter. He gives sense to matter, and this means that the whole world that we find with trees, with flowers, with stones, with whatever, everything has meaning, because the meaning is in the things formed by a spirit. The spirit, of course, in the Bible is called God, but you can also take the ideas of Platonic view or whatever. And this changed in the modern times, and we think now matter has the priority and spirit is a form of complex matter. And therefore, we think that matter, is matter the right word? Excuse me?
Yeah, physical
Okay.
matter, yeah.
Yes, okay. Matter, we think, and I think even believers or Christians have this point of view, because we rose up with this, that matter has no sense at all until we give sense to it. This is the constructivism, and therefore what we find between different kinds of matter, or what is the meaning of it, is just what we construct out of it. But the ancients would have said that if you take a rose or you take a tulip, these are two different things and two different meanings. But today we would say there is just a sense or a meaning that we gave to the flowers. And because the ancients believed that there is meaning in the creation, in everything that we see, that we can touch, that we can feel with our senses, there are a lot of things in the texts that are not explicitly formulated. So this is a world of symbols also, where things are related to each other. I hope I'm still online. I just lost a picture, but
yeah, you're good. Yep.
Okay, and therefore we tend to read the text and say, if it is not explicitly in the text, it is not there at all. But there is a complete world behind the text, and we just can see that in the fact that in many other places in the Bible, or also in Jewish writings from the Second Temple period, so Jewish writings prior to the New Testament, and also in the New Testament, that they see these things that are not explicitly in the text. And modern scholars then often say this is just a later interpretation, but maybe they just make explicit what was clear for them. To just give an example, the menorah tree of life relationship, it is not explicitly there in Genesis 2, and also not explicitly in the Exodus texts where the menorah is built, but for example in the book of Revelation of John, in the writing to the Ephesians in chapter 2, Revelation chapter 2, this writing starts with a reverence to Jesus, who has the 7 lights in his hands, and it ends that who overcomes will receive the fruit of life. So we have there an inclusio between the between the menorah and the tree of life, and we see there clearly. We also see this in ancient Jewish writings, that the menorah was understood as tree of life, obviously, but it is not explicitly neither in the text where the tree of life is introduced, nor in the text where the menorah is introduced. But for everybody who reads the text of the menorah, where God says how it shall be built, it is very clear that it is a tree. And which tree is in the sacred space. So yes, but I think we must learn again to see not only what is in the text, but also what is implicitly in the text. Yeah, I hope this was understandable from the argument.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're making that conclusion based on parts of the text, but also later parts of the Bible, and I would also assume places outside the Bible, like intertestamental period, but also, like, didn't the Egyptians and the Babylonians, didn't they see the world as some type of temple? Is that right?
Yes.
Gotcha. And do you know of any examples off the top of your head that would make us come to that conclusion, that they thought that as well?
In the article that was the reason for this talk, I present one picture of the palace of Zimri-Lim. This is, I think, if I have it right in mind, 16th century BC, so in the second millennium, in the first half of the second millennium BC,
Zimri-Lim in Mari?
Yes, Zimri-Lim in
18th century.
18th, okay, thank you. So I had it wrong, but it's still in the first half of the second millennium BC, and we have there a picture with a two-roomed house, something like the inner sanctuary and the outer sanctuary, and then we have in the former room we have goddesses with a jug where a stream flows out and divides into four arms, as we have it in the Eden narrative, and then we have trees on both sides of the stream, as we, for example, have in the Ezekiel temple, or also in the book of Revelation. We also find this in the Solomonic temple, where we have not one menorah, but a row of or two rows of five, and these lampstands, they represent obviously the trees that are on both sides of the stream. So we have many images, I think, from not only from Mari, which was a kingdom somewhere, I say between Syria and the northern part of Mesopotamia. We also have pictures from Mesopotamia. We have texts also from Ugarit, for example. So yes, I think this is quite a common point of view in the ancient Near East. Yes. Also the garden sanctuary, or that it's a sanctuary or also a palace has a garden that is prior to the entrance of the throne room from the king or from the gods.
Yeah, something I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are. So you mentioned in your paper about the Selim, the image of God. That's obviously typically put in a temple, and humans are made in the image of God. But then later, it talks about in Catherine McDowell's book that you cited, it talks about the Mispi, I might be pronouncing that wrong, and how that could be a reference in Genesis 2-4. Do you think the same lines? Like, do you think that plays into your idea of the image of God at all?
Yes, this is a nice book of Catherine McDowell, where she also shows in some sense that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 belong together, because in the documentary hypothesis it was also argued earlier on that the concept of man as image of God is only found in the priestly narrative, but not in the non-priestly or Yahwistic, and she shows that in Genesis 2 it is full of image of God symbolism, but again, it is not explicitly said. This Mishpi-Pitpi, for example, we have rituals in both in Mesopotamia and in Egypt with statues of gods, and they receive some, in some sense, in a ritual, the breath of life. Their eyes are opened. They receive some food, and we have a couple of parallels there between Adam and Eve. Some of these rituals also take place in the garden, so not in the temple itself, but in the garden that is in the entrance room of the temple. And we have many parallels, and this shows, of course, this is a motive that plays a role also later than in the Old Testament and in the faith of Israel, that there shall not be built statues that represent God and images, but God made His own image. That shall this image, we are this image, and we shall represent His glory. So it does not need some handmade images of God. Yeah.
Very, very fascinating. One more thought, and then we actually might be able to wrap up here. For the, you mentioned, going east, that kind of describes them taking steps in different portions of the temple in regard to Genesis 1-4. But then there's other mentions of going east in the rest of Genesis. I think it's like 7 or 10. Is that, at that point, are they going out even further from the temple, or is that just a metaphor for something else, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think the whole sanctuary concept in the Bible has, in a sense, two antagonistic rooms, namely the room of life and the room of death. It's about life and death, and God Himself is the source of life. So the holiest of holy is the room of life, and life streams out from God. So holiness, as I understand it, is basically it is life force or something like that. And on the other side, we have death and the power of death. With the uncleanness, where if you touch a carcass or something like this, then you become unclean. And these are at both ends of the room, so to say. And every step eastwards in Genesis is a step closer to the room of death. And also in the sanctuary, of course, we have the Holy of Holies, we have the Holy Antechamber, we have the courtyard. But then if we go outside, we have a ring in the camp with the priests and Levites. Then we have the next ring with the 12 tribes. And then we have the outside of the camp. This is the wilderness, and this is the place of death, in fact. And also at the Day of Atonement, they shall the sin goat, or I'm not sure about the correct English word, that is driven out of the camp, and it goes eastward to the wilderness and dies there as an sent to Azazel, as it is called in Leviticus 16. And in Genesis, it starts already with Eden, and the garden is built in the east of Eden. So the garden is not identical with Eden, but Eden is the place where God dwells, and this place has a garden, and God builds a garden east of Eden and puts men into this garden. It's like in Jerusalem, you have the ancient city, and east of Jerusalem, you have the garden Gethsemane. It belongs to Jerusalem, but it is still outside the walls. And then Adam and Eve are driven out into the east. This is then the room east of Eden and east of the garden where Cain and Abel built their altar. Then when Cain killed Abel, he's again he has to leave into the east, so he goes further east, and even later the Tower of Babel is again further east, and I think we have it another time then between Abraham and Lot, where they choose their lands, and it's an interesting play there, because in the primeval history, the garden is in the west and the wilderness is in the east. In the Abraham and Lot story, the fruitful land is in the east, and the promised land, which is less fruitful, is in the west. And Lot looks what the eyes show, and he goes to the east, but this will be then the place, the city of Sodom. Again, we find this in the book of Exodus, where Egypt represents the fullness of life with the Nile stream and with enough to eat, and then Israel has to leave the garden and to go into the wilderness, and God reveals himself in the wilderness in another tree that represents in some sense the tree of life, the burning bush. So we see after the sinfall that the gardens that are created by man can also be illusions from the real garden, and you have to leave them and wait until God brings you back into the true garden. But I think this east motive is very clear that there, and of course you also have it in the promised land, because they come from east. Or if you leave the promised land, you you enter the Jordan, and on the other side of the Jordan you have left it. This is also in the east. So we have geographical things, we have things in the stories in Genesis and in other books. Yes, it's an important concept, and it's also interesting because all temples, the Tabernacle, the Solomonic Temple, the Ezekiel Temple, they all look westwards. The Holy of Holies is always in the west. As far as I know, I'm not. I do not know anything about everything. I know something about it, but not everything. I think the temples in the ancient Near East were usually oriented to the east, to the rising sun. But Israel shows the rising sun its back and looks to God, because the sun is only, again we have this in Genesis 1, the sun is not God, it is only a lamp that God puts on the sky, and therefore they shall not pray to the sun, but they shall leave the rising sun in their back and look to God. And in Ezekiel 8, one of the sins why God will leave the temple and why the Babylonians will destroy the temple is because Ezekiel sees a group of people with the back to the temple and praying to the sun, so they are praying again eastwards. Yeah, it's a motive that we find in many places.
Awesome. This has been really great. I'm sure a lot of people got a lot out of this. Thank you for coming on here. Is there any places, you have your YouTube channel, you have books, you have your paper, could you refer the people to them?
Yes, I have a YouTube channel that I call Lectio Continua, which means that I explain just the Bible from the beginning on in small steps, but it is in German. Of course, if somebody understands German, you are very welcome to watch it, or you can also use the subtitles, watch it in German, but read the English subtitles. Maybe I can also point to my page on Academia, .edu, edu, where I have many of my articles, many of them also in English, the academic articles mainly, that can be read there if somebody is interested.
Very, very cool. All right, thank you for coming on here, Dr. Kilchör. We really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, same to you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to all who are interested in this stuff.